Hello, everyone. My name is Gian-Carlo Carra. I am the City Councilor for the Great Neighborhoods of Ward 9, East Calgary. I'm also your candidate for re-election in the October 18th election. And this is Conversations with Carra, when we were setting up how to run a campaign during a global pandemic. We weren't sure how able to get face-to-face we would be able to get. We weren't sure whether we would be able to run a conventional campaign. And one of the ideas that we had was that we would have a series of important conversations with leaders in our community to help frame how Calgarians are thinking about our city as we go into the polls. Thankfully, or maybe unthankfully, because it's a lot of work, we're also running a conventional campaign and a socially distanced campaign and a digital campaign, but these conversations have been amazingly important. They're also important because this is a really critical moment in Calgary's history. I believe we're at a historic turning point, and we are going to go in one of two directions. We are either going to follow oil and gas into a long and painful descent, maybe led by a class of politicians who are more interested in winning the game of politics than they are in us collectively winning the game of life. Or we will rise on our incredible suite of strengths as a great Western Canadian place to make a great Canadian life. And I believe we need to rise. And I think in order to rise, there's a lot of things we need to do. There's a lot of work to be done in order to actually make the achievement of a great Western Canadian life or a great Canadian life be something that is available to everyone. And equity is a huge component of my re-election effort. Today, we are talking about youth activism in YYC in Calgary. And we are constantly hearing in the news how, although the fact is that Calgary is still growing, but we are bleeding our youth. And there's a Pied Piper story in there. There's something very dangerous about a city that's losing its youth, especially a city that prides itself on its youthfulness. So we've assembled an amazing crew of youth activists. And before I introduce them, I want to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. And I think that that's a really important thing to do, both from an equity perspective and also from a conversation with youth perspective. Because what are we doing when we do our land acknowledgement? We are renewing our understanding of who and what we are as a people. And I think for too long, we just assumed that Calgary was a project of Euro-Canadian civilization that began 100 or so years ago with settlement of this land. And that's not true at all. What we now understand, and what's a much deeper and more meaningful truth, is that this land is a place where different people have come and made community together despite their differences. And that started in time immemorial with the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot people. It started with the Aye Nakota, the Stony people of the mountains. It started with the Tsutsina, the Beaver people. And these are people with very different traditions who, despite their differences and maybe because of the challenging environment that we find ourselves in this arid, high plains desert on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains. While it wasn't always, polka dots and roses and unicorns, they largely made community together and agreed to share the land. And that's what Treaty 7, which we signed, intends for all of us to do. And we welcome the Métis people with their long history on the land. We welcome urban Aboriginal people from across Turtle Island and Euro-Canadians and now international Canadians from every corner of this world as we commit to living in this special place and making community together. Now, without further ado, we've got, as I said, some amazing youth activists here. And in no particular order, I'm going to introduce them. And then I'm going to turn the mic over to them so they can talk a little bit about themselves beyond the bio idea and really sort of that will set us off on our major conversation today, which is how do we make Calgary a place that makes space for youth, that is appealing to youth, that as we rise is a place where youth are driving that rise and are part of that and are eager and excited and contributing members of that rise. So we've got Terry Collins with us. Terry Collins is a two-spirit queer immigrant to Canada. He works within the LGBTQ and two-spirit communities, including educating, supporting, and consulting. And I met Terry because he interviewed me on some of the work that we've done on anti-racism in the city of Calgary. Lasne Kezar is a University of Toronto student from Calgary and the founder of a nonpartisan youth journalism organization called The Written Revolutions. She is dedicated towards amplifying student voices regarding politics and community engagement. Dr. Josephine Tsang is a proud Canadian immigrant and is a passionate change agents activator who has recently founded Change Agent YYC. A former CEO of a charity in the social services sector, Josephine also fostered balanced dialogues with and mobilized Calgarians to act on climate emergency during her tenure at TELUS Spark Community Science Center. Josephine taught liberal arts at Mount Royal University, engaging and inspiring future leaders to instill values and beliefs that science, technology, engineering, art, and math provide an equitable future. And last but not least, Georgia Zebak is a grade 12 student attending Henry Wisewood Senior High School. She's worked over long durations with children with special needs and has volunteered around the city for several years now. She has most recently been recognized as a finalist for the Youth with Distinctions Award in 2021. She's very passionate about generating change in her community. And so what we'll do is I will turn the mic over in reverse order for my introductions and say, Georgia, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
I would love to. Thank you so much for passing the mic over. Well, hello everyone, and I am Georgia. Like I said, or like Terry had explained, I do work with children with special needs. I have for the past couple of years. I have a brother with a younger brother with special needs. So I think that was what kind of fostered my passion for that. I've also been dancing almost my whole life, so I've gotten to like mentor younger youth. And I think those couple of things have definitely been what's motivated me to try to pursue change. And like I said, being a high school student, I think you hear a lot of talk among youth. And I think these conversations like we're having today, and even these conversations among like my friends at school or the people I work with, can be really impactful. And I think there's a lot of potential for growth for youth in the city. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the work that you do in community. Dr. Tsang, the mic is yours now.
Thank you. And my name is Josephine, and please call me Josephine. Pronouns she, her. Thank you so much for the invitation. So glad to be with all of you here, community champions and counselor for being talking about youth activism and youth agency. And to be honest, I feel so excited to be part of this younger crowd as well. So thank you for including me. Founded Change in YYC, kind of an initiative that's been kind of 6 years in the making. In the back of my mind at the time, I wanted to start a science school for girls, and one thing led to another, and I've grown too. And so proud to started this initiative with 2 cohorts of 1 week long experience for 8 to 14 years old, to kind of empower folks to think about what might be some of the ways that they can make changes in the community. And so, yeah, so excited to be part of this conversation today.
I know that my son didn't get a chance to be part of Change It this year, but his best friend Huxley, my campaign manager's child, partook, and they spoke very, very highly of their experience there. So we're going to dig into the work you do a little bit more. Alasne, do you want to talk to us?
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me towards this conversation. It's really inspiring to see other individuals involved in empowering youth. So as mentioned, my name is Alasne, and I'm now a university student. I'm super passionate about politics and youth involvement. And I think that one of the reasons why when people ask me like, why is it important to involve youth specifically? And I think that we cannot really claim to live in like a free thinking and representative democracy if we don't involve a large population of our community. And so as youth, we're like directly affected by these policies. And just because we can't vote does not mean we can't be part of conversations like these. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present some of the work that I do with my organization, which is called Written Revolutions, and also to meet other individuals who are also involved in really empowering youth, because I think that if we are able to mobilize and amplify the voices of youth in our community, then that way we're really able to strengthen our democracy as a consequence.
Sorry about that. I apologize. Thank you so much for that. And I want to dig in a little bit more about what Written Revolutions does over the course of this conversation. But Carrie, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. And the first thing I want to say is I'm very happy that there are so many female identifying people here. I think that's extremely important, that they have their voices heard for this. I'm also really glad that there are actual youths here, again, for much of the same reason. But I'm, again, happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I am queer, I am Indigenous, I am an immigrant from the US. I am a writer for New Tribe magazine for YYC. That's for Indigenous youth. And when I interviewed you for that article you were speaking of earlier, one of the keywords that jumped out to me was, you know, your passion for having a multicultural community. And that really made me excited to jump on board and to be a part of this today.
Well, let's jump into it. So I'll just start with the thesis statement that we hear in the news all the time, which is despite the fact that even through the downturn, Calgary has grown, we're bleeding our youth. And that should be a concern to every single person who lives in this city and hopes for a best possible future, because, you know, to quote Whitney Houston, I believe the children are our future. They are, absolutely. And if a city and a society is not set up to encourage and enable and facilitate youth, we've got problems. So is that true? How do youth view Calgary today, I guess, from your perspectives, from what you know? Who wants to jump in on that? Why don't we go with Georgia?
I would love to. Thank you for the introduction. I think one conversation I overheard this afternoon here, and it kind of fits perfectly in, was a conversation just among kids in the school hallway talking about how excited they were that once high school was done and they could go off to post-secondary, that they would get out of the city and they want to leave Calgary, and they want to, all of them were so excited to leave. I think my stance, I moved to Canada when I was 8. I think, yeah, 8. So like second grade or so. I think the shift was almost being more acknowledged as a youth. I felt like my voice was more heard. And when I moved, I think I had a lot more opportunities to share my voice and to share that perspective. And I think within the city, I've gotten a whole bunch of opportunities within the school board, and then within Youth Central for volunteering, and even with things like this, I've had a lot of chances to kind of share my perspective. So I do think I think that like conversations like these are what facilitate that change, and what potentially, like you said, are with a rising population but a bleeding youth population, can potentially flatten out that curve and invite more youth. I think we generally have an inviting city. like Terry was talking about with multiculturalism, I think we are super inclusive and supportive. So yeah, I think as a whole, when I think of our city, I feel like I almost feel like safe. I feel comforted in knowing that my voice is heard as a youth, even though like I'm unable to vote.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about voting and voting age in a minute, but you did make the statement that you feel privileged in that your voice is heard. You're obviously a youth of distinction, but I also think that probably there are a lot of youth who feel marginalized, and maybe someone wants to jump in on that cover, on sort of bringing that idea to bear. I mean, why don't we talk about Indigenous youth for a moment, then we can talk about the Islamic experience, especially people who are like a hijabi young woman who obviously presents as Muslim and is not able to sort of blend in. Terry, do you want to talk about how multicultural are we? How accepting are we in your experience?
I feel like there's many layers to it, right? Obviously, there's a lot of issues with law enforcement towards minorities. And for me, as an Indigenous person, I don't feel safe wearing my beads, or, as a trans person, as a two-spirit person, maybe wearing a skirt while being very masculine, without bringing on some sort of negative reaction. I don't think it, I don't think the citizens of Calgary, for the most part, would really cause an issue. There's always those, a handful of people. It's always possible, depending on who's around you. But I think there's a part of the city that needs a lot of reforming, and additional training, in order for certain minorities to feel safe going out the door the way they want to and present themselves the way they want to.
That is a totally fair statement, and I think that's Alasne, obviously we're coming off of a summer where there were some blatant Islamophobic attacks on hijabi women in our city, in our park system. And that's underscored by some significant incidences of Islamophobia in other parts of Canada as well. How accepting have you found Calgary?
I think that oftentimes as individuals, we pass blanket statements that really generalize the situation for all of Calgary just because we ourselves haven't maybe experienced marginalization or alienation, and we're coming from a place of privilege. But just because we haven't faced any act of racism or discrimination does not mean that there are those attacks, or there are those microaggressions still taking place in Calgary. And as a person of color, having immigrated to Canada and specifically to Alberta, I was quite shocked by the attacks that had taken place. And walking down in downtown, I often get stares, and now it has come to a point where I'm used to it. And I shouldn't be used to it, because this is not the norm. It shouldn't be the norm. As a Muslim woman, I'll often have to, defend my humanity. I have to justify my place in society. And I think that we don't expect that of we don't expect that of other communities that don't belong, that are not visible minorities, perhaps. So I think that definitely there needs to be work done, but we also have to recognize that no city is perfect. No city is ever going to be perfect. And Calgary is largely tolerant, but we have to also acknowledge that there are these acts of racism and microaggressions and discriminations that do take place that really prevent youth, and especially youth students of color, people of color from different communities, to really want to continue living in Calgary. And I think that's actually what Georgia said at the beginning, is that a lot of students are looking for a way out of Calgary, when that shouldn't be the case. That Calgary should be a place that people would want to live, to feel safe in, and that we need to work towards bringing that safety and that atmosphere.
Josephine, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, thanks so much for all the comments provided so far. I think what I'm hearing from all of you tonight, and also some of my experience in the past few years, what I'm hearing is how can we find hope? How can we find meaningful participation in the city? And how can we be catalysts for change? And I wonder if, and I've been to different meetings in the past that we all talk about the future of Calgary, yet we don't have youth sitting at the table to be that voice, because we are building the city that we want folks like Terry, we want folks here to be part of that, to make that meaningful change, yet they're not there. And I'm so glad that we're having more conversations like this, because ultimately that's the future, and we need to engage more and to kind of think a little bit more about leaving Calgary, and excited to leave the city and explore somewhere else. I wonder that might be something that we all wanted to do when we're young. And I'm going to, and I would say that might not be unique in Calgary for Calgarians. Now, I also understand that there have been people departing, and there are also wonderful people joining the city as well. So perhaps in order to find a little bit of being the catalyst for change, finding that hopefulness, having the skills, having the tools in your toolbox, or in everyone's toolbox, I should say, in my toolbox as well, and finding ways to make action. I would say, that knowledge and action combined would give us hope, and we can continue to find ways to build on those nuggets.
Okay. I've got a lot to say here, and I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I really appreciate you bringing that up, Josephine, because I do think that youth leaving town is a concern, but I also think it is natural, right? And we actually want our youth to go out, experience the world, get different perspectives, and then hopefully come back and further enrich us with those experiences. And that can be a good thing. I think that, harping on the idea that youth are bleeding out of the town is part of sort of the negative sort of narrative that we're giving ourselves. And, in the beginning, I spoke, my campaign stump speech where, politicians want to win the game of life, or want to win the game of politics at the expense of us all winning the game of life by, exacerbating grievance and making us feel angry and afraid. And I think that probably the truth lies somewhere between those two poles, where there are some warning signs on the wall that we should absolutely look at, but we should also celebrate the idea that we want youth to go on walkabout and experience the world, and then come back and join us. But I will tell you that, I'm very sensitive to the idea that in order for us to be successful, and in order for us to rise, we have to fulfill the promise of Canada, which is to be a beacon of equity, and to a place where people of diverse backgrounds and outlooks and cultural backgrounds and experiences make community together. And so in my Rise Together platform, the first leading value I'm talking about is equity, anti-racism. And in the context of Canada, there can be no anti-racism that's not built on a foundation of truth and reconciliation. And so I think part of the challenge we have is that we're starting to have this conversation now. And some of us get it, and some people don't know what the hell we're talking about. And then there are some people who are actively triggered, and you know, who view that as a threat to their way of being and their way of life. And so I suspect that as we have this conversation more, there's going to be an awkward period where we are facing more active overt racism and more attempts to maintain privilege and to maintain systems of oppression. Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in. Wanted to share that you know, one of the community champions here tonight talked about tolerant. Tolerant is simply tolerating is not enough. And coming from, you know, myself being a BIPOC, part of the BIPOC community, and having talked to youth and my personal experience too, sometimes racism is out there and everything is out there. And sometimes I find that internally, just the anticipation of something is going to happen sometimes makes it even worse as well. Like that internal dialogue that I have sometimes when I walk down the street, or when, you know, I've talked to other youth, you know, walking down the street, that hasn't helped as well. So you know, I think this is definitely a very lengthy discussion, and it takes all the different partners, different community members to come together to find ways to talk about, like, yeah.
So what does an ideal end state look like? What, like, Alasne, what would the ideal Calgary 5, 10, 15 years from now feel like, or look like, or behave like, contrary to what we're experiencing now?
I think it really sort of boils down to this idea of Canada being a mosaic of cultures, you know, as opposed to perhaps, let's say, our wonderful neighbor towards the south, where it's less about assimilation and more about celebration. So you're celebrating the different, you know, diverse communities that exist, the different people with their different collective identities, that you're allowed to be Canadian. You're celebrating your culture, your religion, your faith, your individuality, but you're also celebrating being, you know, part of this Canadian identity. And so I think that ideally for me, Calgary in like 5, 10, 15 years would be a place that continues to celebrate diversity, that is a city that where people really truly feel like they belong, even though they may not be, you know, they may not have been born in Calgary, but they're able to form these wonderful different connections with different collective groups while still being able to uphold their individuality and their individual identity. So that would be an ideal Calgary for me, where everyone is, where everyone belongs, and not belonging by virtue of assimilation, but by belonging by virtue of that diversity.
And that is, I think, a beautiful statement that resonates with my values. And, you know, I immigrated to Calgary. I became a Canadian citizen in 2005. And, you know, certainly my abandonment of the States and my celebration of being Canadian has to do with exactly that, rejection of that sort of assimilative force and that celebration of the cultural mosaic. Terry, do you want to weigh in as someone who, you know, we're in a moment, in a point of history of truth and reconciliation? Do you want to sort of weigh in from the Indigenous perspective?
I can definitely do that. For me personally, it boils down to humanity and recognizing the human in the other person, not the misinformation, not the assumptions. When you look at that person, they become that, either a mirror of your fear or a mirror of your love for your community. And I think a lot of people, you know, are in pain. And when you're in pain, it's very difficult to find that empathy and to find that humanity in other people. I also think that A lot of Indigenous people are leaving Calgary or refuse to come to Calgary because of, there's a lack of support from the actual systems in place. And we're starting to see those systems finally being challenged in a public way now, which is great. But when you're a person who is already what's the word? Uh, when you're a person who is a minority who is susceptible to facing these extra challenges from other people,
By the system.
yeah, exactly. Um, you really want to make sure that, you're safe. Safety is, a basic human right, I feel, and I don't think that really gets talked about enough. What does safety look like? And uh, what does that mean for different cultures as well? What does that safety look like for them?
I can tell you as, a cisgendered white guy, uh, it's been a bit of a journey this last 2 years for me, and it really, it started, we're celebrating Pride Week right now. And, I was reflecting on the fact that the beginning of this journey really began with a huge public hearing, the largest in Alberta municipal history up until that point, uh, talking about banning conversion therapy to create a safer space for LGBTQ two-spirit people in our community. I apologize for stumbling over that. But we banned conversion therapy, and on the strength of being able to hold that kind of meeting virtually, and in many ways that virtual meeting opened it up for people to speak, because we had people speaking their hearts, not scarily standing there at the podium, but calling in from the comfort of their home and sharing their experience in a much more intimate way. It was an amazing experience. And I'm very proud that council banned conversion therapy, but that also gave us the opportunity a couple months later to really dig into an inquiry into systemic racism. When Black Lives Matter exploded onto the world stage and people exploded onto the streets of Calgary, and there was a very real call to take the conversation in the streets into the halls of our government and really make it what our government's about. And so we had a 3-day inquiry into systemic racism. And I think all of these things have totally transformed my thinking, and that's why I'm leading with equity and anti-racism. I've had the opportunity to sit with elders, Indigenous elders, over the last couple of months, and they always speak about love. And you're talking about empathy, Terry, and I think that's a critical point. Can I pivot the conversation right now, though? Because I do want to talk about a couple of other things, but they're very closely related. And when you sit with Indigenous elders, you're always talking about the land. And the other thing that I think is sort of critical to this, and I really want to bounce it off of all of you, is the idea that climate action and safety and being safe, like on the ground, and respecting the land is a critical component of all of this too. And so a big part of my Rise Together sort of mission in this election is really to say it's going to get absolutely explicit about climate action. And how important is that to you? And what does that mean on the ground in terms of safety, in terms of quality of life, of all of those things? I'll throw it right back at you, Terry, to start, but I'd love to go around the table here.
It's scientifically proven that when we're in nature, our stress levels naturally drop. And I think there's a lot of stress in our community right now between COVID, between racism being confronted, between anti-protesters, what else is going on in the world that's affecting our views of the people around us. Nature is something we're a part of, not above. And I feel that, there is a point in time where the nature was, you can only have so much of it, and then that's the perfect life. Very short cut neat lawns, no wildflowers, no, planting non-indigenous gardens, and really just affecting the food chain that you're still a part of, no matter whether you live in the country or in the city, you're still a part of that circle of life. And I know for me, nature is a big part of my spirituality. I believe that the animals and the trees and everything were here before human beings. And Creator asked them, will you teach these new beings how to live in this world? And those animals accepted that, and those plants accepted that. And that's why, everything, like when you smudge, you treat those plants like children, because they are holding you up, they're offering you protection, they're offering you some sort of teaching, that that you should be open to. And I think there's a lot of examples in nature and how nature copes with us, that's really yelling at us like, hey, you're not doing this right, look what's happening, you're not listening. Okay, now half the world's on fire and the other half's flooded. Are you listening yet? I think there's clear results, there's clear consequences of our actions within nature. And I think we really need to pay attention to that. And I know a lot of youth now are being able to reach podiums, or being able to reach especially with the expansion of Zoom and all the technology that we have today, being able to get their voices out there. Um, what do you think, Georgia?
I think between this point that you brought up and the very last point you made, it felt like a puzzle fitting together in my mind, because you were talking about this idea of safety being like a blanket for everyone, and that I was thinking about it and I was like, well, the standard for safety should be the same, right? No matter how you identify or any minority groups that you belong to, you should feel safe in a city, despite any of those differences that we might share. And we talk about these minorities, and it is subjective, because human nature, it's been repeated generations and generations of the segregation of racial and other minority groups. But it's interesting because, like you said, we all belong to nature. We all breathe the oxygen that from the trees, and we all were born on the land, and the land wasn't ours originally. So I think it's really interesting that a lot of the times it's something really controversial when, like you said, we can see those tangible impacts, when we couldn't, when it was plus 40 and can't see the trees in front of you, with all of the smoke, uh, and now the floods and everything like that. I think sometimes people are like unable to empathize with people who are in other segregated minority groups, because they can say, well, I like we were saying earlier, well, I haven't been discriminated against, or I haven't felt this, so it's hard to put yourselves in their shoes. But this is something that, like I said, we all experience. We all breathe the same air. And you brought up a really good point with the therapeutic effects of nature. It reminds me, whenever life gets a little chaotic, which it definitely is at the time, with all of the crazy things going on in the news, and then also getting back into school in the fall and everything like that, I always go to one same spot in nature, and it brings me so much peace. And to think about taking refuge in the land, the thought of it not being there, it absolutely terrifies me. And I think it is super impactful to see from a youth perspective, because like GC said earlier, we are the future generation, and we will be we will be the politicians and we will be the people that do have all of the power in the years to come. So I think the fact that we are gaining more awareness and seeing the effects of what is happening, I think it's super impactful. Thank you for sharing.
The last thing.
Yeah,
From
so I
the,
definitely,
from,
sorry.
go.
Okay, so I definitely agree with what the previous two speakers have said. I think that two things actually really need to be brought forward, and that's climate action as a political prioritization on the political platform, but also climate education, because, you know, although we are all experiencing the effects of climate action, there's still like gaping holes that are present within the education system that really allows people to gain a deeper understanding of really what's taking place with our planet. Because we hear in the news there are actually some politicians who absolutely just deny, you know, climate change in its entirety. They don't believe that it as a concept, and pass, you know, absolutely preposterous statements like, well, you know, it's cold in so and so place, so there isn't really global warming, without really understanding what climate change is all about. So I think that if we're able to first educate people, and not just through the school system, but through different means, by reaching those, you know, rural areas or far reach areas, to really educate communities about climate change and climate action, that's the first step in really acknowledging that this is a problem and it's an existential problem. And then we'll really be able to prioritize climate action, because you know, I really love the idea, the indigenous idea of the fact that we can't own land. You know, land is there and we have to respect it. We use its resources, but the land isn't going with us, right? So we're not owning land, and we have to give it its due importance, its due respect, which is why if this land or this, you know, our environment is ruined, there's really no planet B for us. And that is why we need to prioritize climate action, and not just by reducing our own ecological footprint, but also by pressuring the you know, the oil and gas industry, for example, and other economic industries that have a huge carbon footprint that have really impacted our climate.
So I feel like youth deeply understand climate in a way that adults and people who are currently in power either don't understand, or, you know, to quote Upton Sinclair, it's impossible to get a man to understand something when his job depends on him not understanding that thing. Josephine, you work with youth, and through Change It, like how much is that looming large in the minds of 8 to 14-year-olds that you work with, and you're training to be changing?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that question, because this climate action, climate emergency is definitely something that's on my mind a lot, on all of our minds a lot. And wanted to follow up on one of the notes earlier, where, you know, even though we all know, well, not all, so most of us know that it's been caused by human. Climate action, climate emergency, unfortunately, you know, talking to a general public, that appears to be a political issue when it shouldn't be. And you know, communicating climate change, communicating climate emergency to the general public is really about what's the narrative that we wanted to share, and what's the common value. And you know, it's interesting to find out that, you know, about half of the Canadians, half of us, learn about climate change through talking to friends and family. And so that's where I feel like, and I know, you know, informal education has a role to play to share, to share more ideas on how can we make changes. We don't have to, we as in all of us, whether we are 50 years old, whether we are 80 years old, or whether we are 10 years old, we don't have to wait for the government. We don't have to wait for certain institution to give us the right to do something. We all can do it. And it's something that I think about it a lot. It's how, and how can we do things? How can we be perfectly imperfect? We don't have to be perfect and have like 100% or 98% to make changes. If we can have millions of people doing things perfectly imperfect, that's how we create change. And that's kind of one of the fundamental values of how be a change agent came about, is that we're shifting that power dynamic. We're shifting that power conversation. Let's have a bunch of us do something and learn about, or not learn, have that experience that and seeing other community members who are doing little change. Oh, I shouldn't say little, because actions, meaningful actions, daily actions. So we can all be part of that, build that momentum so things can happen.
I love how this conversation is just sort of like dovetailing into, the three values that I'm leading with my Rise Together platform. So we've talked about, equity, and we've talked about climate action. And then the other part of that is really the role, I think, of government. And I agree completely. Like, I come from a background where, my urban design background before I became a politician was really about the idea that you have to think locally but act globally. And that's really what you're talking about. And I think that that's never been more true than it is now. But at the same time, I also think that COVID and the climate crisis is also teaching us that not only do you have to think globally but act locally, we also have to act globally. And that really requires political systems that we can sort of bank on and respect. And I'm deeply concerned that in North America, we've been fed for several decades now this slow, steady, toxic drip of misinformation that somehow government is evil, somehow paying taxes is evil. And I think that really resonates in our youth, because our youth do not vote in the numbers that they should. They're not engaged in the idea of government. They're not taking that change it role in their community and exporting it upwards into the halls of government. So my platform is really based on the idea that we have to reaffirm the role that government is and make it something that we can all plug into and that we're all invited to be a part of and to partake in. How do we get youth more politically activated? And I know that I'm going to go to Alasme. How do we do that?
So that's a great question. I think that youth feel often, not just youth, I think this actually extends to just the general population and, individuals who don't really go out and vote, who don't exercise their civil liberties in that way. I think that the reason why we do that is because we feel disempowered. We feel that we're not really capable of bringing about any difference. And that is really a very skewed idea, because the entire basis, the fundamental basis of a democracy is that the power dynamic is shifted from the government to the people, that the people who vote in the government are responsible and really, take possession of that decision-making power. So as youth, although we aren't voting until the age of 18, there are many ways to get involved. One way is this conversation, for example, that we've been able to discuss so many meaningful topics without the ideas of youth like myself and Georgia being dismissed as, you're too young, you won't understand. So that involvement is really important. And what I do with my organization, the Written Revolutions, is it's entirely 100% youth run. And I recruited initially 16 youth from Calgary, and we developed and built this organization to attract students from around the world and from Canada to really engage in their civic duties by writing articles or by sharing poetry that is all based on a political, social, business, economic, or environmental topic. So journalism is a great way to get involved with organizations like ours, or even with Youth Central, for example, the organizations that we already have in Calgary. They all involve youth in these conversations. And I think that, politicians often what happens is in the end that because we're not voting, there's this idea that our can be disregarded because we're not voting. But the thing is, as youth, we are just in that timeline where soon we will become voters and we have to deal with the consequences of the legislation that's left. And that's why it's important for students and for politicians to really gauge the interest of youth, get them involved in youth wings of governments, in conversations like these, in discussion forums, so that youth feel that their voices are being heard, that we're not disempowered, and that we're capable of making change.
Should we lower the voting age in municipal politics to 16?
I absolutely agree with that because, in Alberta, we're able to drive at 16. There's no reason for youth to not vote at 16. I think youth are more than capable of understanding the issues that concern them locally at a municipal level. So I think that if we're capable of driving safely at the age of 16, then we should definitely be able to involve in politics, especially when politics, govern and really affect each and every aspect of our lives.
Georgia, you want to jump in on that?
I would absolutely love to. I think it's the thought of driving myself to go vote in my head right now seems so far gone, but it seems exciting at the thought. I think a lot of youth, like we had just talked about, are turned away by the fact that they can't vote. And then, like they had said, adults or people that are eligible to vote and the people that choose not to vote will say, oh, well, like, I'm just one vote, my vote mustn't matter. And that's absolutely the beauty of multiculturalism, and why we celebrate our diversity in Canada is because everybody comes from different backgrounds and everybody allows their voice to be heard through these democratic actions. So I think getting youth excited, like this is like Elasne had just said, this is their future, and like you had talked about when we were talking about climate change, we're going to reach a point eventually where these effects are irreversible. So thinking that just because we are under the age of 18 we can't generate any change, well, if you think about it, if democratically we are not supported the way we need to be and our voices aren't heard, when we are old enough to become in power and are old enough to like we said, vote or run in elections or whatever we would like, when we're old enough to express our views, it might already have reached that irreversible point where the things that we want to change can't be changed anymore. So I think it's just that awareness piece, making us aware that just because we aren't reaching the eligible voting age, like we had said, doesn't mean we can't make an impact. And I think the education piece that comes with it, even before you're eligible to vote, is what allows us to generate that sustainable change when we are eligible to vote.
We've got like 5 minutes left. This has been a great, engrossing conversation, and the time's flown. Terry, do you want to weigh in on that or offer any closing thoughts?
I had a few thoughts, and the one that really jumped out the most was I would love to see resources teaching youth what their rights are for free, whether that be commercials or advertisements or get-togethers, cupcakes, and let's go over what your rights are as a citizen, and as a youth, because there is a transitional period between being a teenager and becoming a young adult where those rights kind of shift, and you have to how do you learn what those rights are?
That's a great point. Josephine, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I want to share that and a couple of other ways that youth might be interested in getting involved. Get involved with your community associations at the camp, at the Change in youth experience. We invited someone from a community association to come and speak about, it is kind of the fourth level of government. And for campers, for kids, for adults like myself to hear that, that's very empowering. And get involved with your community, help be a volunteer, support other nonprofits that for the causes that you believe in. And we also invited, talking about education, and we invited someone to speak about the importance of voting, recognizing that campers are too young to vote. I think there's a piece around, yes, campers might be too young to vote, yet there's a power in having a conversations with the families, with your parents, with your neighbors, with your grandparents over at Thanksgiving, because that's how seatbelts, wearing seatbelts, how recycling, how smoking cessation, all of that came about by having youth like you, like all of you, having conversations with your neighbors and with your families.
Wow. So a lot of things to discuss. I just really appreciate all of this conversation. I think that, My Great Neighborhoods platform, which is what I've been pursuing for 11 years, and it's morphed into Rise Together, it's really based on a city of empowered community level governance that is inclusive and responsive. And that's work that's underway. Over the next 4 years, we have money in the bank to sort of pursue that multi-age businesses, residents, not-for-profit players, governance in the communities of Greater Forest Lawn, which is one of the most diverse places in the city of Calgary. And I would love to see sort of youth involved in that. But you've renewed my passion for the importance of getting everybody involved. I would like to invite everybody, talking about Forest Lawn. We are running our 5th of 5 community parades through the communities of North Forest Lawn this Saturday, September 4th. And we roll through the neighborhood streets on our bikes and sort of model that active mode behavior that sort of turns the city into more of an accessible place for all of us. And we pull a local singer-songwriter, and I encourage you and everyone who's watching to come join us. We leave from the Franklin station of the LRT at 10 o'clock, and then we roll through Northern Forest Lawn. And at noon, we're going to roll up to the playground on 52nd Street, right south of Jack James High School, and we're going to serve Jamaican food to everybody. And we have a couple of amazing Indigenous artists, including the traditional knowledge keeper for the Crawford Ward 9 campaign, Wendy Walker, is going to be performing. And on top of that, we're going to have a number of candidates that are endorsed by a group called Look Forward, which is a friend to youth, a friend to a hopeful future for our city that includes all of the things we've been talking about. And so we're going to see some really exciting candidates in this upcoming municipal election. So I want to welcome and invite all of you to join us and everyone who's watching. And I just want to thank you for a great conversation tonight. This has been really special. So thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.